Pentiment is Obsidian's finest game. It's something I believe in too firmly to tease it throughout the video. An adventure game set in a historic setting with excellent and captivating writing, all brought to life with an enchanting art style. Due to all of this, Pentiment is a game I can't recommend highly enough. Why? Well, that's what the rest of the video is for after all. I don't take what I said lightly. Obsidian is a studio I carry a lot of respect for. For me, Knights of the Old Republic 2 is the best Star Wars game, Fallout New Vegas was the successor Fallout 2 deserved, and Alpha Protocol...
Almost like you gotta stick your knife in it to kill it. I mean, the thing's still fucking moving.
Well, it just needed more time to make its excellent branching choices mechanic shine. My decision to wishlist this recent release of theirs was taken rather quickly and without many reservations. Not because it has Obsidian slapped on it, but because it promised a historical setting. 1 year ago, I poured a lot of heart and soul into my Kingdom Come Deliverance review, so it's only fair to celebrate the anniversary by doing the same for another historically themed game. So what's going on in Pentiment? Well, you're in the shoes of Andreas, a young 16th century artist practicing his craft in the abbey of a small Bavarian village. More precisely, he's working in a scriptorium, illustrating books alongside a few dedicated Benedictine monks. Coming from a wealthy family, he's following the path of all young artists of the time. They traveled from one place to another to get trained in multiple styles and techniques before settling down, getting married, and becoming qualified to be master artists with their own workshops. That's the starter regarding of how well the historical setting is used. There are many things I want to touch on, but before that, let's talk about the gameplay. The game plays like a classical point-and-click adventure with a simplistic 2D perspective and the ability to navigate from one section to another. Everything takes place in the village of Tassing, its surrounding forest, and the abbey of Kirsau, so there's not much traveling to do. The item collection aspect is also essentially non-existent, so all that left is the dialogue system, and you get that in spades. There's no attributes, abilities, or a leveling system to speak of. Instead, during conversations, Andreas is asked about his life and education, after which the game offers several options. He could have spent his apprenticeship years in Italy, Flanders or Switzerland and occupied himself with either living his life, learning how to be a savvy businessman or being an avid book reader. These don't give you fantastic in-game abilities, but they offer new dialogue options. The best thing about them is that they're well designed and thought out. Not only each path comes with spades of well-researched and plausible text, but they're not even a superpower. Just because you can use your logician's background in an argument with someone doesn't mean that a monastery nun will give you the information you want, for example. That's in very large part due to the quality of the writing. Andreas interacts with many people, each with distinct occupations, preferences and characters. As things move on, he will ask people for information and favors. Because not every person is as easy to convince, you'll be put in situations where choosing the right words can make all the difference. Since everything about the writing is consistent, trait-related options are not excluded from this mechanic. I went in trained by other RPGs to consider these fancy trait-exclusive choices an easy path to get my way, but Pentiment did not waste any time in teaching me a lesson. And if I'm at this stage, I should mention the more fleshed out mechanic of building a relationship with other characters. From time to time, you'll see the ominous "this will be remembered" prompt, bringing flashbacks from Telltale's days. But don't worry about it, the apparent lack of subtlety doesn't run very deep though, because Obsidian did a much better job implementing it in both its setup and payoff. Firstly, these crucial decisions you've made are not explicit in their implications. Sometimes the talk you just had leaves you wondering what in the hell is so important about this. The answer is usually hidden from you since the depth of the characters runs more profound than the bits and pieces of dialogue you had until that moment. Thus, you might say something very relevant to someone and have no idea why until later. Then comes the part where you bear the fruits of your decisions. These moments are unpredictable, with no apparent clue they're about to happen. Most importantly, you have no choice to make here. You can only read the NPC's opinion over your past actions, and from there you're a click away from accepting the result, whichever it might be. This is not the setback you might think, because Pentiment's purpose was not to be a puzzle game but more of an interactive story. An NPC's refusal to help you out isn't the end of the world either. For example, you have multiple paths to choose from, each with its own implication for the story. Your choices have a tremendous impact over the fates of the people of Tassing and Kersau, and not always in the expected way. When you start the game, you meet the people from the village and the abbey as Andreas goes to work in the scriptorium. Ordinarily a quiet place, Tassing is very animated with the arrival of Baron Lawrence Rothvogel. He's the primary benefactor of the abbey, which otherwise struggles financially, so making the Lord feel welcome is in everyone's thoughts. People talk about it, from the abbot to simple peasants with no interest or love for the church's business. This visit serves as the game's introductory chapter, and oh boy, it introduces. Not game mechanics, because there aren't many to speak of, but dialogue, lots and lots of dialogue. Conversation that's rich in detail and abundant in flavor, all serve to present every person you interact with in depth, but also to paint a clear picture of the world you're part of. I don't even know where to begin with this point, so here's an honest effort on my part. Please note that some of the things I'll mention are my own thoughts and not explicitly taken from the game. The Abbey's extensive old manuscript collection was already hard to maintain, but using the transcription techniques to copy them put a further financial strain in a world where the printing press had existed for over 60 years. This contrast is often reflected in conversations, with Andreas more or less practicing an old art that was on its way to obsolescence. Even so, there's much emphasis on how much artistic talent and knowledge was required from transcribers to perform their craft. The artist's role was paramount, since medieval manuscripts had elaborate handwriting and included plenty of illustrations. This made the overall process extremely slow and laborious, adding to the difficulty of finding and training someone to do it. This is one significant reason why throughout the Middle Ages, the Church handled not only the preservation of old manuscripts, but their transcription as well. While artists participated in the process, the monks often did it. Simply put, nobody else had the money or skill to perform this task. On the other hand, one crucial detail that's presented almost fugitively is the reality that transcriptions weren't necessarily one-to-one copies of the original. Either text or image, the fidelity of their reproduction was in the hands of the transcriber and the intentions behind his work. Granted, the printing press did not address this problem, but it's an important detail nevertheless. This situation also created the space for discussing the artist's place in a changing world. Printers enjoyed much success using their new invention, however the techniques to produce art were still not developed enough to compete with trained artists' abilities. Not only they could create more intricate details, but they could also use color unrestricted besides the limits of paint supplies, while the press was still some way from creating fully colored books. So artists like Andreas were in the position of having their work highly praised but deemed out of fashion when it came to copying books. The fact that Kersau's abbey was the last one to still employ the old transcribing techniques is very often repeated as a consequence. The village of Tassing is not faring any better. Having to pay ever-increasing taxes to the abbot, their life is more or less on a knife's edge. Despite being pious, the villagers don't sympathize with the new abbot or the financial situation of Kersau. Since the village is at the bottom of the valley, the other being at the top of the hill is another proof of the relationship between the two, mainly when the flood hits and the monks are left particularly unscathed while the villagers are desperately toiling to save everything they have. Even so, talks about Martin Luther's movement do not occur very often, despite his thesis being published a year before the start of the game. This is not an oversight, since Bavaria sided with the Roman Catholics in future religious conflicts. Although I should note that when it comes to kingdoms within the Holy Roman Empire, this was the reflection of the ruler's faith or political interest rather than how popular Lutheranism was. On the other hand, more prominent are the mentions of old pagan traditions involving the likes of Perchta or the Wild Hunt. Frowned upon by the church, as you could imagine, these folk teachings are passed by word of mouth from the older generation to the young. Most importantly to the context of the game's story, they're seen as the true reflection of the village's history and culture. Christianity is seen as the force that tries to erase and replace this with its teachings and philosophy. This isn't far-fetched considering that many popular Christian celebrations are merely reinterpretations of old pagan counterparts. In the early days of Christianity, this was the way the church managed to slowly convert the local population of Europe. Charlemagne, who gets mentioned in Pentiment in this very context, ruled over what is now everything between Germany to the east, northern Spain to the west, and half of the Italian peninsula to the south. He had a prominent role in the missionary effort during the 8th century. It should be no surprise that his official doctrine considered the Christian faith the only thing that bound his multi-ethnic empire, thus why conversion was so sought after. This level of historical detail is not a coincidence when you realize that Josh Sawyer has a degree in early modern history, and also happens to conveniently have ancestors from Bavaria. It's pretty apparent that he's put that knowledge and connection to great use in a way that only someone with his background would have been able to. This goes so far that even the fictional village and abbey have the proper naming conventions used in Austria and Bavaria at the time. This attention to detail remains at a high level throughout the rest of the game, with many of these themes continuing their development. So, if you thought the game would run out of gas in this sense, fret not, because that's not the case at all. The only source of Protestant thought of significance comes from the visiting Baron himself. His attempted debate with the abbot creates the expected ruckus. Otherwise, the Baron is a well-read intellectual with a very open mind. He is very interested in chatting with Andreas because his university studies allow for an engaging exchange of ideas. While the main reason for the visit was to check the status of the manuscript he ordered from the abbot's scriptorium, he also wanted to gift the abbot a long-lost book depicting the ancient history of Tassing. Unfortunately, this doesn't happen because the Baron is murdered the very next day. Before you get mad, this is not a spoiler even though we're 3 hours into the game. We're only just finishing the introductory chapter, in fact. The main suspect in the killing is Brother Piero, but Andreas is convinced he couldn't have done it and wants to find the real killer. Thus, from here on out, Pentiment becomes a murder mystery story, and the lengths it went to present each character in detail proves to be no accident, and the strength of writing becomes ever more apparent. A murder mystery usually depends on how interesting the side characters are. What would be the point if you didn't give a crap about bland characters? Pentiment never even comes close to this issue. More importantly, provides multiple plausible suspects for the murder. First is Prior Ferenc, who was seen by Andreas engaging in suspicious activities ever since the Baron arrived in Kirsau. Another suspicion is laid upon the nun convent, who acted very standoffish when he came. An old widow, who cursed the Baron when she saw him, raises another question. And last but not least, the village stonemason was seen having a very intense argument with the Baron just as he arrived. All 3 leads can be looked into, but there's only so much time at your disposal, and there's not only those 3 leads, what the f. All 4 leads can be looked into, but there's only so much time at your disposal until the Archbishop comes to conduct his official investigation. What further complicates things for Andreas is a series of ominous notes he finds, written in exquisite script that seemingly points toward the killer. This is where time becomes an important thing to look after. More precisely, the game's setting is split between time segments. The only way to move time forward is to engage in certain activities that take a lot of time, such as eating lunch, working, or sleeping. Otherwise, you're free to roam the village and its surrounding to your heart's content. But as I say this, those time-sensitive activities also happen to be the most important ones. For instance, asking the stonemason about the argument between him and Baron yields no results, so your only option is to spy on him. Before you can crack his secret messages, looking into the prior's business requires you to learn how to decipher code and some introductory astronomy. The old widow refuses to answer questions until you help her around the house, and the mystery regarding the nuns requires you to break into the library in the dead of night. All these things take time to do, and most of them overlap, meaning that you have to pick and choose what to do. You can do all of them, but then you miss out on the exciting lunches and dinners you're invited to. They're not always necessary for your investigations, but they provide a lot of dialogue. As you'd expect, breaking bread at the family table is an excellent opportunity to learn more about them, their personalities and how they see things. Even if they're totally unrelated to your investigation, the information you can gather from them is precious. One thing I did not mention until now is that the dialogues are entirely in text form, no single line is spoken. While it's definitely the cheaper option from Obsidian's standpoint, the reality is that this approach matches perfectly with the game's themes. That's because every dialogue is animated as if someone is actually writing on a piece of paper. Not only are the scripts used intricate and very aesthetically pleasing, but the sound, oh my god, the sound is so soothing. It makes what would otherwise be a very quiet exchange of words into one that provides a calming experience. It's incredible how much can be achieved with such a seemingly simple trick. But there's one more reason why this choice was deliberate. The writing style associated with this character is meant to reflect their education status or profession. You've got peasants, scribes, humanists, clerics and printers, each with their own distinct style. But here's the kicker. Remember when I said that there are things you might not know about people when you first approach them? Well, it applies here as well. Early in the game you meet Till, a simple shepherd, and discuss the Roman ruins found throughout Tassing. Soon enough, he reveals to you that what he knows about them doesn't come from old stories, but in fact from extensive lectures of the Abbey's books on the subject. The moment this revelation occurs, the font within his speech bubbles permanently turns from one reserved to peasants into one for scribes. It's an absolutely terrific attention to detail, but also a sign that it's not the last time this will happen. From here on out, spoilers are becoming very hard to avoid. I'll mark the chapters appropriately, but right now I'll discuss the end of the first chapter and I'll reserve a section for the general aspects before I dive into the spoilers. By the end of the first act, Andreas will have gathered enough information on several of his leads. The Archbishop knows about his investigation, so he's interested in hearing what he has to say. This is when you have to make the first critical choice of the game, because your accusation will get someone executed whether you like it or not. Even mentioning suspects you have no concrete proof for will influence future events, which I found very welcome. For instance, mentioning the stonemason had an intense fight with the Baron, but then providing no evidence of any wrongdoing will hurt his reputation in the village. The mere suspicion that he could have committed the murder affects his standing and harms his ability to perform his craft, despite someone else being found guilty of the crime. Other games taught us to say everything we know without consequence to the people mentioned, when in fact these things would have noticeable effect. Yet another lesson Pentiment offers with its intelligent writing. On a very spoilery note, the person who dies now has significant impact over life in Tassing. Getting the prior killed ferments more mistrust from the villagers, because you also reveal that he was involved in necromantic activities. This was my approach in the first playthrough because that's the path I could find the most proof for, at least. Investigating the other suspects reveal a lot of intriguing things about them as well. For instance, the nuns reacted the way they did because many years ago the Baron attempted to rape and ended up severely beating one of the sisters. This clashes with the initial impression of the Baron, who, up to that point, looked like a charismatic intellectual. Initially you felt sorry for his death, but with this knowledge in mind, it's difficult to think so anymore. You can either point your finger at her and have her executed, and even if you don't, you can mention her relationship with one of the monks, creating a lot of animosity towards you. How you use information like this can have profound consequences, and it's an impressive feat to say the least. The second act takes place 7 years after these events. Andreas returns to Tassing as a master artist, always on the road for various commissions. Many things have changed and not many for the best. The abbot's taxation regime became even harsher and restricted many rights of the peasants. This kept pushing the villagers closer and closer to a revolt with the charismatic village carpenter at its helm. But most importantly, Andreas is a changed man. 7 years ago, he was excited to pursue his career as a master artist since he loves his craft. The requirement to go with an arranged marriage to be legally eligible for his own workshop did not scare him but did not overjoy him either. 7 years later, he's become a very successful artist, but the love of his craft was almost gone entirely. Between creating frivolous work for eccentric clients with deep pockets and constantly being on the road, life isn't what he expected it to be. This is an excellent opportunity to highlight another layer of dialogue and character building I did not mention until now. During the first act, a thought bubble appears below the reply choices whenever Andreas has a moral dilemma. These will lead you into Andreas' mind, who weighs the multiple available approaches. They all reflect aspects of his inner dialogues, with each element of his personality represented as batteries from Dante's Inferno, Socrates, and Saint Grobian, the informal god of vulgarity. During his dream sequences, this court offers guidance as he seeks to better himself and find the truth of the Baron's murder. Despite the appearances, there isn't a morality system per se. The only consequences are those directly related to the content of the dialogue itself. I appreciate this way of doing things since I think good-evil axes are a bit gamey when it comes to games like this. And in a title heavy on quality conversations, it would have been redundant and out of place since the text is more than capable of conveying the consequences of your actions. In the second act, this thought bubble mechanic is very much changed. Socrates and Saint Grobian's approaches are no longer available as options. What's left is not even an option but a series of scathing remarks that spiral into something resembling self-loathing more than anything else. Soon enough, Andreas realizes that Beatrice is also gone and is replaced with melancholia. In one of these inner dialogues, we also discover that Andreas lost his son, and his grief overwhelms his thoughts. For the rest of the game, this becomes one of the central themes of the story, but not the only one. I can't restate enough times how well developed is the game's writing. Most stories struggle to juggle a couple of themes, but Pentiment tackles more at a time and can nurture them properly. Shortly after, another murder occurs and yet again an ominous note is found, just like last time. Andreas already had doubts about the person he accused of the Baron's murder, but now he has the confirmation that he was manipulated and the culprit is still out there. The difference is that the person he's saving is not a dear friend like Father Piero was, but the abbot that's hard to sympathize with. And long story short, regardless of who you accuse, this act ends up with a peasant revolt. Fed up with the abbot's draconic laws and pushed over the edge by the recent murder, they burned down the abbey alongside its manuscript library. In a desperate attempt to save the valuable works stored there, Andreas rushes inside and is never seen coming out of there. What follows is another 18-year time skip, leading us into Act 3. You now play as Magdalene, the town printer's daughter. The village is very much changed, of course. The abbey has been abandoned, while the local nobility maintained roughly the same taxation regime. Although the trauma of the revolt is still present, the people have moved on as much as possible. This act won't have you perform a murder investigation. Instead, Magdalene takes it upon herself to paint a mural that commemorates the history of Tassing. I have to give it to Pentiment for how it set up the new character. Her educational background is, in fact, chosen during the previous act when Andreas gifted her a book when she was just a child. A minor decision that turns out to be a meaningful choice at the drop of the hat is just one more of the game's pleasant surprises. The other traits she can choose fit her education and role in society, and it's very pleasing to notice the differences. Like last time, their only function is to provide different but non-game changing dialogue options. This whole chapter is dedicated to her efforts to uncover the village's past. This provides an exciting challenge in no small part because her father was left bedridden after an attack from the same person leaving the notes Andreas kept finding. Unaware of the past notes, Magdalene wonders what is happening as she starts looking for clues about the history of Tassing. This process opens up some very interesting concepts. For each stage of Tassing's history, there are multiple versions that all sound equally plausible. The village was either founded by Romans or local tribes. The stories of their guardian saints are all very different depending on who you ask, and naturally, the revolt is described very differently by those who lived through it. And as Magdalene keeps looking for more and more information, she finds proof that can offer different degrees of support for each version. Unlike the two previous acts, the time mechanic is much more relaxed here. You are still put in a position to make choices that exclude others, but overall there are fewer things to do and people to talk with. I don't necessarily have a problem with it because the story is obviously closer to reaching its conclusion. Gameplay wise, things have been the same ever since the game started anyway. One elegant difference I do have to mention is how time is represented. Playing as Andreas, you'll notice that everything is adjusted according to the canonical hours every time you skip time. Monasteries use these to organize the daily schedule with times of prayer, work, meals and others split accordingly. But when you're playing as Magdalene in Act 3, the canonical hours are replaced with the mechanical clock. This reflects the changing times since the abbey has been abandoned and a clock is now part of the new Rathaus. But on a deeper layer, this also reflects what was happening in many European settlements during the 16th century. The mechanical clock was invented 2 centuries earlier, but the expertise and precision required for their construction meant that for a long time only major cities like the ones in northern Italy had them. Around the time of Pentiment setting though, they started appearing in many smaller communities. Clocks brought with them a significant change in the way towns and villages operated due to the impact they have had over the perception of time. The canonical hours were by no means precise and they split the day into uneven slices. Considering what they were created for, this wasn't an issue. But clocks changed everything. It allowed for precise schedules for one, but their influence spread into every aspect of society. They encouraged the formation of a more mathematical perspective of the world. Thus, Europe began rapidly catching up to the rest of the world and slowly became the dominant power. Trade was severely improved as a consequence, but even painting and music benefited from it. Painters started using perspective and geometry, and music began using a more precise structure that we now know as music theory and timing. The clock's influence is never elaborated in Pentiment, but its visual representation was too much of an excellent opportunity to elaborate. The story takes a turn when Magdalene starts putting things together and becomes more convinced that someone in the village has been orchestrating all the murders. Joining efforts with Andreas, who wasn't dead but in prolonged isolation, they explore the old Roman baths and arrive right underneath Tassing's church. There they have a shocking discovery. The notes were written by a woman claiming to have visions of the future under the guidance of the priest who took care of her. The priest's motive for everything was to protect everyone from realizing the truth about Tassing's past. The village worshipped Saint Morris as their guardian figure, based on old statues unearthed centuries ago, and his hand was displayed as an object of worship for the visiting pilgrims. Stories and legends were passed from one generation to another, supporting this version of events. The reality that the priest became aware of was that the statue in question was nothing else than one dedicated to Mars from Roman times. Realizing that the entire mythos of Tassing's saints was built on lies and misunderstandings, he tried to stop anyone from revealing the truth. He had the Baron murdered because he brought an old book attesting to the village's Roman origins. The second person was killed because he claimed to have found Saint Maurice's head when in fact it was the same Roman statue of Mars. And lastly, Magdalene's father was attacked because he was determined to paint the mural that would have revealed the true history of Tassing. But how did the priest know how and who to manipulate into committing these murders? As absurd as the prospect sounds, the explanation is relatively simple. Every single person in the village and abbey was confessing to him. Bam! Just like that, the villain's omniscience turns from ridiculous into something entirely natural. Of course the priest knows everything about the villagers. Confession to a priest is therapy under a different name after all. I really enjoyed this twist. It was already clear that the villain was looking to keep people from digging into Tassing's history. but the reveal and the reasoning was very intriguing. There were multiple ways to interpret it as well. The first version is that the church stifles the truth to serve its purposes. Father Thomas explicitly mentioned his fear that people would lose faith in the church if the truth got out. Thus, it's easy to conclude that it serves as a parallel to how church operated in general. The fact that holy artifacts were routinely forgeries is another matter that does not escape me when I consider this explanation. Just like St. Moritz's arm drew countless pilgrims to Kiersau despite actually being the arm of a Roman statue, so were many real-life holy objects of dubious origin. But I believe this explanation is missing the real point. This wasn't some cynic cleric rubbing his hands over manipulating some peasants to benefit his small village church. Father Thomas's actions look and sound more like fear of the uncertain mixed with personal zealotry. He knows his actions are morally wrong and he's very aware that they're completely divorced from his faith's teachings. The Baron's killing was more calculated but ultimately pointless because the book was stolen by a thief in the same morning and is never seen again unless Magdalene finds it years later. The second killing prevented the discovery of the statue's head, but it omitted the fact that Roman artifacts were constantly discovered by the villagers and nothing came of that. To make matters worse, the assassination transformed the frustrated peasants into a violent mob that ultimately created much more harm to the village in the long run. And finally, the last attack was not even planned, with Magdalene's father walking into Thomas's path the moment he planted one of his notes in the workshop. To make amends and keep his secret hidden, the priest breaks the church's foundations and buries the ancient Roman bath. Speaking of which, the fact that the church's foundation was fragile was planted right from the start of the story and it went completely under my nose until this moment. The end of the game even gives you a moral choice whether to keep the lie safe or to tell everyone the truth. The decision is more complicated than it might seem, and as far as I'm concerned, I'm a big fan of how it's laid out to the player. Telling everyone that their priest was directly responsible for a string of murders over 25 years definitely sounds like a morally correct choice, but does it matter anymore after his death? Will a village traumatized by violent revolt be better off if they find out that everything they hold dear about their local faith has been a lie? I definitely appreciate that the game doesn't push you in either direction, but it's yet another testament to the writing's quality that you have so many things to weigh when you consider your final choice. But the fact of the matter is that when it comes to the most significant and important events, you have no choice over their outcome. The Baron still dies, the peasant revolt still happens violently, and the priest dies and kills himself to take his secret to the grave. Your investigations don't prevent anything from happening, but the many little choices do count and leave a mark on the people of Tassin. At the end of the game, you get to see the completed mural alongside the detailed village heritage tree that changes radically depending on the small but decisive choices you make along the way. I mentioned previously that Pentiment tackled multiple significant themes. How did it fare in the end? In the case of Andreas' grief, I would say pretty good. It's a story that deals with a lot of pain and fear of loss. At the same time, it takes the rather erudite approach to portray his inner thoughts and feelings. The best part is that it entirely fits the background of an intellectual well trained in classical arts. In fact, his entire character arc was handled really well, including how the different stages of his life were portrayed in this context. Speaking of which, other characters also go through remarkable transformations in ways that are relevant to my point about the choices you make. Some of the villagers change dramatically between acts. The best example is Dr. Werner. During the first act, he's an arrogant prick who doesn't only think he's better than everyone else, but loathes the peasants. But during the second and third acts, he's clearly becoming a better man. He's not the only one that changes, but his transformation is the most obvious. The historical references represent the second pillar of Pentiment's writing. It includes many elements I already mentioned, and I have no qualms repeating my admiration for their accuracy and details. The impact of the printing press, the Reformation movement, Martin Luther's ideas, and the peasant revolts all are looked at in detail and care for their subject matter. But many minor details get the same attention, immensely contributing to immersion in this world. One excellent example revolves around a character with very little importance to the story, so much so that he can be ignored entirely without affecting the main plot. Brother Sebat is a traveling monk originating from Ethiopia. He's an exciting figure, but what's most impressive is his reading of biblical stories to the village's children. That's because he's relying on his own Ethiopian Bible, where every person is represented as dark-skinned as opposed to how European drawings did it. I was very impressed with the different art styles chosen, that goes without saying, but this highlights an interesting fact. Religious illustrations have always been determined by two essential concepts. First, they reflected the world as seen by people who made them. An Ethiopian artist who grew up around people like him is likely to only know how to draw people looking in a similar way. The second thing is that illustrations were addressed to an audience and had the role of presenting their stories as relatable to them as possible. This meant that it made sense to portray saintly figures in a way that resembles the people you drew for. Just as exotic these Ethiopian drawings looked for white people in Bavaria, the same would go for European portrayals if they'd been shown to regular Ethiopians. Nowadays, this subject has different connotations and implications, but we mustn't forget that the mobility and perspective of your average person was extremely limited during the times before the Industrial Revolution. Pentiment does cover this aspect as well. The fact is that most people never traveled far outside their birthplace, and it wasn't rare for a peasant to never leave his village during his entire life. Thus, seeing a person of different skin color was unlikely to happen outside the influential trade centers, but not impossible. Brother Sebat mentions that only a few villagers aren't intimidated by his presence, making his stay in Tassing a bit sad and lonely. There's one more theme I want to touch on. I left it in the end because it's by far the most important in my opinion, and its full extent dawned on me quite some time after I started playing. As I already mentioned, the speech bubbles you see have nice animations. One reason I say so is that they're not always written the first time correctly. Often you'll see several incorrect letters be erased and replaced. It's a nice touch that reminds me of the days when I still used the pen and paper regularly. Mistakes were something that occurred naturally, a line drawn too long, a circle not looped correctly, or even a brain fart resulting in drawing an entirely different letter to what was needed. It wasn't a big issue since errors were easy to correct, but now imagine I would have had to use pre-modern instruments instead of modern cellulose paper and factory-made pens and pencils that are affordable and readily available to me. With more expensive materials and greater difficulty erasing mistakes, the writing process was more deliberate than my carefree approach. Erasing was done by rubbing a fine stone over the paper, meaning that it wasn't something you could do very often, since it involved destroying bits of the page. This is shown in detail right as you start a new game, in fact, in this slightly awkward mini-game of sorts. This act of erasing and replacing past work is also applied in art. In fact, the game's title is a direct reference to an Italian technique of painting additional layers of paint. In both cases, the old layer can be detected using modern technology, bringing back stuff previously thought to be forever lost. With books and manuscripts, it's even more interesting since countless valuable works were hidden in plain sight. The old paper was either erased or rewritten or used as part of book bindings of much newer books. The best part is that it fits the past's erasure and replacement metaphor. Tassing's history has multiple layers you must dig through before you have a clear picture. But one more thing blew me away when I put it together. I don't think I need to explain that I'm not an English native speaker. This means that unfamiliar words get mixed up with ones I know before I become aware of the differences. Pentiment looks like my language's word for penance or penitence, and I did not realize the reference to the Italian pentimento technique for a while. So when I looked for it, you can imagine my surprise and amusement in discovering the root of these two words is shared in Latin. Penance is the spiritual embodiment of erasing and starting over, so the shared origin fits like a glove. Never underestimate the love of the ancient Romans for metaphors. In other words, the game's title describes the story to a great extent. Spiritually, Andreas is searching for forgiveness as part of his grieving process, and it becomes a large part of his character arc in the second half of the game. On a different kind of metaphor, Pentiment discusses how we perceive our history, with multiple layers of the past being covered and mostly forgotten in time. These things are not explicitly stated, but the clues are seen everywhere. The animations showing minor errors in writing that I mentioned earlier are just that, but many conversations also reference this. I could talk about the little variety of gameplay, about how all you do is move back and forth between the people you can converse with. I could criticize the tediousness of it in quite some detail. I can even mention my annoyance over the control scheme that, for some reason, never allows the usage of the mouse and keyboard simultaneously, but only one at a time. And as much as these are valid points of criticism, I don't think there's a reason for it. Strong writing is the main focus of Pentiment, and nothing can take away from that. Not every game needs super developed gameplay to work, and at the same time, dialogue trees with consequences that don't affect the plot's main events still counts as gameplay even in my book. What Josh Sawyer and Obsidian achieved is nothing short of incredible. It's a game that uses a staggering amount of documentation to offer a strong backbone for a well-developed story. How often can I say that a video game comes with its own recommended bibliography provided by its lead designer, and that it includes both fictional work and non-fiction scientific studies? I try to keep my head on my shoulders when judging games. I don't like being in the shoes of a hater that sees nothing good in what he's playing, but at the same time, I don't feel comfortable gushing non-stop. Pentiment doesn't allow me to avoid the latter though. I couldn't recommend it any more than I do. Obsidian has outdone themselves. Thanks to everyone for watching. Like if you haven't, subscribe if you want more of the same, and share this with your like-minded fellows. And until next time, cheers!